Okay, I'm Clancy Cavnar, and I'm moderating this panel. I would like to first just show this book, Ayahuasca Healing and Science, that just came out, that is contains chapters from all the authors, from all the presenters that are here. And we just got the copy today. It hasn't even been opened, so I hope it's as good as it was in the pre-press. So now I'd like to introduce the presenters, and I'm gonna introduce them all, and then we're gonna ask some questions, and we're also asking people to ask questions in the Q&A that they would like to hear answered. So first I'm gonna introduce Jessica. Jessica Nielson is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, which resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. She is a neuroscientist conducting research on ayahuasca users self-medicating to treat post-traumatic stress. She has also recently begun a new study to investigate how psilocybin alters visual perception and the time course of neuroplasticity changes in humans after the experience. Okay, next is Adele Lafrance. I don't know if I should be putting you on screen or, I don't know, but I'm just going to introduce you and then we'll go.
We're here.
Okay. She is a psychologist and adjunct professor at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. Dr. Lafrance has published extensively in the field of clinical psychology, and she is a co-developer of emotion-focused family therapy. She is also studying the use of plant medicines and psychedelics in the healing of mental health issues, with a particular focus on ayahuasca and eating disorders. And finally, Kim Kuypers is a researcher and associate professor at Maastricht University. She has been studying the acute effects of psychedelics on memory, mood, and empathy, and the underlying neurobiological mechanisms for 15 years. Recently, she also started to look into the effects of these substances on creativity and its link with empathy. She hopes that we will be able to use this knowledge to enhance flexible thinking and social abilities in daily life and in the pathological populations, and consequently to enhance quality of life and feelings of well-being. So those are our panelists, and we have some questions that we generated, and then we're going to ask for questions from the audience. So the first question that I would like to ask, and I hope I understand how this works. What kind of research is needed to understand ayahuasca's full potential? So I hope that, not sure how this works.
Yeah, I can start. I thought a bit about it, and I think, so we need all kinds of evidence. We need the anecdotal evidence, because it's out there and it is the best experiment that we have. We need the quasi-experimental studies that we also do. So we go to retreats where people take voluntarily ayahuasca and then test them with objective tests, so computer tests, but also with questionnaires. And I also think that we need studies that are conducted in the lab, yes, in a more sterile environment. But still, I think that all these kinds of evidence can complement each other, and then also look, so like I said, look at the subjective level, the objective level, performance, but also biological measures. And one of the findings I think I like the most is the enhancement of neuroplasticity, and that is something that intrigues me. And I really think we have to look into, because it has been shown that it lasts for, I think, 48 hours after you took ayahuasca. So I think we can tweak the whole therapeutic session to that. Yeah, but that's my thought.
Okay, we'd like to know if the other panelists also have anything to say about this question.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add all of that, as well as qualitative subjective experiences. I think, there's a lot of these questionnaires and really trying to reduce things down to numbers. And I think there's a lot that gets lost in really trying to understand what's going on in someone's mind. It's not trivial to try and kind of wrap our minds around kind of this ineffability of an ayahuasca experience. But I think a lot of the earlier anthropological research and also just qualitative methods can be really useful in trying to identify some common themes that people have and really trying to describe what that experience is. And that's there's obviously going to be some conserved patterns that we see. I know I found this in my survey study. But then there might be things that are just different based on someone's culture or their upbringing or what kind of mental health disorder they're coming in with and what their specific needs are and what they found to be helpful or not. And so I think, you know, it's really kind of a multidisciplinary approach to really kind of understand this and not trying to minimize it to numbers, but also recognizing that, you know, careful study design and looking at some of these other quantitative measures like neuroimaging and other things could be useful blood-based biomarkers, but I don't think they really capture the full spectrum of what we can understand about ayahuasca and its therapeutic potential.
Thank you. Adele, you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Jessica and Kim's perspective. You know, I've done both qualitative and quantitative research, and when I've been kind of trying to move the psychedelic medicine into the eating disorder world, very much there's a need for kind of the lab-based studies, and also there's been a really kind of influx of enthusiasm based on the qualitative research that has come up. And so I think that's really important. From the qualitative perspective, I feel like we also need like the small and deep dives so that we really can get the details that I feel are required, especially as we move towards like policy and policy change, you know, and also larger scale qualitative studies so that we can get to see these themes in addition to those lab-based studies. And to Kim's point about that period of neuroplasticity, I've been working with different compounds and we've been exploring the benefits of really good psychotherapy as an example within that 48-hour window. And in our last study with ketamine, we found that when the participants rated their emotional breakthrough post the psychotherapy session, 24 hours after the medicine dosing, they actually rated it as high as they did in Robin Carhart-Harris's study using psilocybin, I believe 20 milligrams. And so I was so excited about that because I just thought like we can apply this to across medicines and really, really, really benefit from, you know, that potential. I know that the jury's out in terms of if it's actually true and if it actually happens and if it's actually 40 hours, but you know, the data that I've been able to see so far and the personal experiences, you know, supporting individuals in these ways really seems to show that there's an opportunity to optimize. And I guess the other thing that I would add is that I think that not only we need to do research among the participants who are having these ayahuasca experiences, but also I feel like we need to ask a lot of questions, both using standardized instruments, but also interviews for the facilitators, the support staff, because I feel like so far the field has kind of focused on primarily on the participant experience, and there's so much to be learned from the folks who support this work, both the indigenous people and the psychologists and mental health professionals and, you know, other types of support staff who are also there.
Yes, that was something I was also thinking about. We really need to know what the practices are and what the best practice could be. We also know that the whole setting contributes to the therapeutic effect. So there's a lot to learn about everybody who is facilitating these sessions. And what I would also add is there are a lot of ayahuasca retreats taking place. And actually, if all those retreats would collect data in a standardized way, it would be so awesome. We would have such a nice database because they also do not use the same composition. And if we would be able to know about the composition they used, we could link it to the therapeutic effects. But that is just thinking out loud or stating what my best experiment would be.
Well, on that note, I had a question that I added to the question list, which I really would like to hear your responses on. My question is, what elements of setting are most important for ayahuasca healing, and how do these differ from settings now used in clinical research in psychedelics? Because I remember a long time ago, I was trying to plan a research on ayahuasca, and it finally got down to, well, how are we going to get these results unless we have a shaman? And then it was like, well, which shaman are we going to? Then that got into like, well, how do we separate the shaman's power from the power of ayahuasca, and how do we control that? So I just wondered what elements do you think could be used in clinical settings, and how might that impact the results? So I'll start with Jessica, just because she's underneath.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I was trying to touch upon in the book chapter that's in this new book that's launching today, really trying to look at these qualitative subjective experiences or kind of trip reports, and trying to get at what people found to be helpful or not helpful or potentially dangerous, and how that could translate into what would be needed in kind of a more therapeutic context, maybe in a clinical setting. I think most people are kind of doing this in a more traditional sense and going to a retreat center, and in trying to bring that into a clinic, I think there's a lot of factors that may not be conducive with a clinical setting. Like, I think most of the settings aren't going to be in a group situation, whereas most traditional ceremonies are in group. So I think that's kind of a big difference between, say, the psilocybin assisted therapy you're seeing right now versus how ayahuasca is traditionally administered to people. I think it also depends on what the disorder is that people are going to be treated for. I've been noticing, I can only really speak to post-traumatic stress, and really making sure that people feel safe and they feel like they're working with a very experienced and competent facilitator. And perhaps for people that aren't from these communities and these indigenous cultures that are used to some of the ritual and ceremony around it, that might seem a little aversive to them because they're not used to it, and it's kind of this unknown element. Also having, maybe a trained psychotherapist as well as the shaman that could help kind of make them feel safe. I know specifically with PTSD, who the other people are in the ceremony is really important for that aspect of safety and trust, so that they can really open up, because that could be harmful if they don't feel like they can trust other people in the room. So those are kind of just my initial takeaways. Safety just being the main key, safety and trust.
Okay. Other panelists?
Yeah, I'm not a setting expert, but I once designed an experiment in which I wanted to look at setting. I did not get the grant, so I was not able to do it. But what I wanted to compare was a clean clinical setting and a nature environment, or a more a room that is with nature elements. I think nature calms people, and perhaps Jessica touched upon it. It might be dependent on what the patient or the person is comfortable with. So it might be, you might think of a personalized setting, that somebody's feeling more comfortable at the seaside or in the woods. But like I said, I'm not a setting expert.
Yeah, I would echo, the importance of safety, and there's so many ways that we can help cultivate safety for an individual who's participating in this kind of work. And some of that is just the setting, and the relationships. So really building relationships with the people who are going to be supporting you beforehand. The other element that I've been kind of reflecting on as a safety is actually beginning the integration planning prior to even participating in the medicine experience, so that people are already thinking about what kind of internal and external resources they will be able to draw from, depending on how it all goes, because sometimes the integration can be smooth and other times it can be extremely rocky because there will be disruption of systems happening both internally and externally. And so putting a lot of attention to that. And I think about the studies that I'm kind of designing or supporting the design for coming up with ketamine, with MDMA, with psilocybin. And what we did was that it was very much a clinical setting for our last study, but we tried to bring in rituals that of course were not going to be the same types of rituals that you would see in an ayahuasca ceremony, but we wanted to bring in the power of rituals. And so it was as simple as starting every session with a breathing practice, ending every session with the clinic facilitators sharing how witnessing their work was meaningful for them so that they could see the ripple effects already. And so, not the kind of rituals we're used to, but I still feel like the power of rituals is so important that this is kind of one of the ways that research scientists can bring in that element for healing. And I guess the third point I would say about this piece is that when I interviewed ceremonial leaders of ayahuasca over the last few years about what they felt their role was and how they viewed the healing process, there was one quote that stood out, and I wish I could remember it exactly, but he basically said, "My job is to get out of the way of the medicine's capacity to heal the participant through love, to help clear the blocks to love from self, from other, from spirit." And so that's a challenge, because so far in the more academic or clinical settings, love is we still have to use the word unconditional positive regard, to kind of keep it cool. But I'm really trying to actually integrate the word more often in the clinical research so that we're speaking of it explicitly, so that we're bringing it into the healing spaces. And we as facilitators are using the word to describe our universal feelings for the participant. But it's tricky because it can be an ethical minefield if there's not clarity and purity, to the essence of that work. But when I think about psychedelics, what do they do? I was talking to a colleague recently, and he's like, psychedelics, in my opinion, can be boiled down to two things, in particular ayahuasca. Either it helps you to connect to love, or it clears the blocks to love. And so I would really love to kind of put out a call for our colleagues to start to look at more systematically the role of love in healing in the context of ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm. So I want to follow that up with a question. What are the advantages or disadvantages of employing mental health professionals in ayahuasca retreat settings? We'll start with Adele, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can speak from personal experience because I'm a psychologist and supported retreats abroad. And when I look back at when I started to where I am now, I do have twinges of regret in terms of how I showed up and how I supported some of the work, because I didn't know anything about ayahuasca until 7 years ago, and since then it's been a deep dive. But I came from it really from the perspective of everything is intrapsychic, and really kind of focused on my training, which my training was done in Canada in a very particular cultural context, in a place of privilege, and I didn't have the awareness that I do now, and still growing, in terms of all the biases that come with it. And so over the years, when I've learned from Indigenous healers, I've learned that I have a lot more to learn, and that I have to be careful, actually, in terms of how I support people's interpretations of their experience, how I understand the shamanic world. It's only in the last 1 or 2 years that I've really, really kind of begun to understand the shamanic elements of the work, the spiritual elements of the work, that it's much more than the psychology of it. And so I think the downsides of having trained mental health professionals is that there's a lot of catch up to do in order to be able to hold that space in a good way, in a fulsome way that respects all aspects of the material. On the other hand, I do really feel like there could be great benefit, because there's so much wisdom, skill, training from our studies, supporting individuals with different mental health disorders or emotional or psychological crises, that we can kind of smooth the waters when they get really choppy, and also have an awareness of the red flags that might indicate that this participant might need more of a specialized treatment setting in addition to what's going on ceremonially. So there's a couple thoughts.
Okay. Jessica?
I would echo some of that. I am not myself a clinician, and I'm sort of more researching it from a scientific standpoint, but I kind of have my reservations about the Western medical model trying to appropriate some of the indigenous practices, just because I think, you know, there's a long lineage of them kind of knowing what they're doing and how to handle it. And then, you know, trying to fit it into this Western medical model, I think you lose a lot of that ancient knowledge. And you see this a lot in kind of other things, like not taking seriously like traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture and things like that, that thinking like the Western medical model is the best. So I've kind of wanted to study it more kind of from the sidelines observationally. I think I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do an ayahuasca study in the United States and who would be the facilitator? What would the setting be like? Where would we get the plant medicine from? Would we make it in a lab? Would we get it from the churches? And ultimately I decided not to do it and not move forward with it because it just didn't feel right to me. And so I'm just kind of sticking with the survey-based research, observational research. And yeah, I think there's some interesting insights, and obviously, you know, white people with mental health disorders are very interested in doing this. And I think there is, you know, some aspects of creating situations for those people that want to do ayahuasca and making it feel comfortable and safe that does borrow from some maybe more Western medical practices that they feel comfortable with, so they can optimize their integration of it if they do go down to the Amazon to take it. But yeah, I think it's kind of a tricky space to navigate as a American white researcher that doesn't really have knowledge of the whole lineage and tradition. So I've pivoted to doing more psilocybin research for that even also has its own issues, but you know, using the more pharmaceutical grade stuff that's made in a lab rather than over harvesting stuff in the environment. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I was also thinking about it. Yeah, I'm also not a clinical psychologist, but I teach. So I see psychology students who will become clinical psychologists. I've integrated it in the curriculum they have, or I have a course, an elective that they can take, so that they get acquainted with it. But I think that not everybody who will become a clinical psychologist will end up in psychedelic medicine. But I want to have psychedelic medicine normalized. So I think that it should enter the normal things they are being taught. And then that you have a trajectory after that where you have a selection of people who are qualified or people who have the qualities to become psychedelic, a sitter or a person helping with the healing process. That's what I wanted to say.
Just add one thing too that I just kind of thought of, like, I get a lot of queries relating to eating disorders given the work that I've done in this field for a few years now. And at this time, I don't feel comfortable, you know, recommending, I mean, there are professional practice issues around that as well. Anyone with an eating disorder to go down to the jungle. I was just there in December and I was just putting myself in the body and the mind of someone with anorexia nervosa. And I would really, really be concerned about them not being able to maintain their weight with the dietary restrictions and the foods that are available. And so recently I was speaking to someone who was just really like, I need something, like I've tried everything. And so I thought, well, bring your therapist, bring a family member so that they can support you with those other pieces so that, you know, you don't go down to the jungle and then lose 20 pounds, which is going to be a major problem for someone who's already low weight and potentially on the border of being medically compromised. And when we did the qualitative research that's featured in your book, Clancy, one of the things that participants did say is that they really wanted a blend of the indigenous practices with ceremonial ayahuasca drinking and the support from eating disorder specialists who could support the behavioral aspects of the recovery process, as well as some of the emotional processes. that they didn't feel they were able to get outside of with strictly ceremonial ayahuasca drinking. And so I thought that was really, it's a tricky one. Like, to Jessica's point, how the heck do we do this? But I think an important one for certain disorders where there needs to be equal attention paid to the spiritual, to the emotional, to the behavioral, in addition to the shamanic.
Yeah, maybe those sessions that have people with more severe mental health problems would be appropriate. I've seen a lot of facilitators acting as therapists, people who their qualification is that they drank a lot of ayahuasca. I'm not sure if they're the most qualified, but then I guess I would rather have one of them talking to me than somebody like a psychologist who had never taken ayahuasca before. So it's a strange area. Here's another question for everyone. Can the ayahuasca experience itself be traumatic? And I'll let whoever wants to start answer that one.
I can take that one first, just because I've seen direct reports from my survey study of people saying that they had traumatizing ayahuasca experience, that they went into it kind of not having PTSD and came out of it with PTSD. I don't think that the experience itself is inherently traumatic. I think when the setting is not safe and the facilitator is inexperienced and there's other elements that just don't feel safe, then I think it can be traumatizing. And I just know anecdotally from some of my friends that are integration therapists that have had to, help their clients process a lot from a really bad ayahuasca experience. I mean, it's a very intense experience. I think there needs to be a lot of focus around making sure that they feel safe and they can trust their environment and their facilitators and the whole support system around it. So yes, that would be my answer to that question.
And do you think that trauma could be treated by another ayahuasca session that was a safer environment?
Potentially. I worry that the person wouldn't want to go back and do it because it's, kind of like going back and doing exposure therapy. But maybe in a different setting, different facilitators, different support system, it could work. But they might want to try other more traditional methods first before going back.
More traditional than ayahuasca?
I mean, traditional from the Western standpoint of like talking to their psychotherapists and really figuring out what came up, why was it traumatizing, and then maybe get them better prepared to do it again.
Yeah, Jessica, when you say that it's traumatizing, do you mean then that their latent emotions came to the surface and being confronted with that and not being supported was what, or that they just saw their trauma, that it came to the surface? But
so it's a combination of both. So people with PTSD going down there, I think having to relive their trauma can be re-traumatizing if not held in the right container, similar to exposure therapy. If it's not done correctly, it can be re-traumatizing. But then there's people who didn't have PTSD going in and the facilitator sexually assaulted them, or they got mugged, or something happened during the session that gave them a trauma that wasn't necessarily the experience itself, but they were in a vulnerable state that made those other things really traumatic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's about the safety you addressed previously. Yeah.
The first example of someone going down to work on trauma, how I kind of distill it is the difference between a painful experience and a traumatic experience is what happens next. And so you can have a really painful experience, a really challenging experience in an ayahuasca ceremony. But to Jessica's point, if you have the right container, the right support, and for the length of time that it is required in order to fully metabolize the material that has arisen, then it remains a challenging experience that leads to post-traumatic growth. But if you have that really powerful experience, very challenging experience, and you don't have the right kind of support for the right amount of time, and I emphasize that because an ayahuasca retreat is often like 7 to 10 days. That's enough time for some people to put themselves back together, but not everyone. And what's offered or available subsequently can be insufficient to really metabolize that material. And therefore, it does have the potential to become a traumatic experience. And I certainly have witnessed that myself, in research participants and in just know people in my life where they ended up with PTSD post ayahuasca and they did not go in with it. So I think it's a really, really, really important point to think about in the retreat setting and also in the follow-up period if individuals are needing more time.
But then also to standard include their therapist at home, that they follow up, that they are being included in the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's another question. What are some of the potential dangers perceived by ayahuasca users who have PTSD or any severe mental health problem? I know that was a focus of Jessica's, and we talked a little bit, but I just wonder if you want to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so specifically with PTSD, one of the things that kind of separated out from some of the other themes when I looked at these subjective descriptions of what they found to be dangerous was a lot of physiological reactions. So people with PTSD are kind of hyper aroused. They'll have like spikes in heart rate or blood pressure. And that also happens on ayahuasca. So there was just more of that they felt very concerned about, that maybe they were going to have, a heart attack or a hypertensive crisis or something. Other than that, it was again about feeling that, there was somebody else in the ceremony or in the circle that they couldn't trust. They didn't know what was going to happen with them. Were they going to be violent? Were they going to threaten them? Not feeling that the facilitators were experienced enough. It was a variety of different retreat centers and various settings, people doing in their living room. So it was kind of like a mixed bag of set and setting. And so, yeah, not being with somebody that they felt knew what they were doing and knew how to hold space for them and knew how to process what was coming up. Some places people were kind of left alone and there was no guidance or facilitation, and that seemed pretty dangerous. Some people did kind of take issue, which I think is maybe more of a cultural issue, with Westerners going down there and kind of feeling that it was unsafe that the shaman was also taking ayahuasca and not having, the sober sitter. But that's kind of I think that's just sort of like a disconnect in the culture. But some people did find that they perceived it to be dangerous. Not having access to purging facilities, not doing enough of the preparation and sticking to the diet, and then kind of feeling the adverse effects of that when they got into the experience, whether they didn't wean off the medications they were on appropriately. Yeah, and then also just not having a container afterwards to process it with somebody that really could handle what they needed to talk about afterwards.
Did any other want to chip in on that question? Adele?
I'm happy to speak to a little bit about it. Yes, when I asked the participants in our study about the challenges and risks that they either perceived or experienced in the context of ceremonial ayahuasca use, many of the similar themes arose that Jessica just spoke to. So psychological challenges in terms of feeling like they didn't have the internal or external resources to move through overwhelming sadness, fear, anger, shame, disgust, especially in our culture that's so emotion avoidant. We don't have a lot in moving through those really, really, big experiences. Others talked about the lingering effects, the lingering pain once they left, or the disruption to their systems. And so all of a sudden they go home and they don't feel the same way towards their partner. And now they're in this crisis of like, what do I do? This was not a problem before I left. Now I have to deal with this, or I don't know how to talk to my parents anymore because I saw for the first time the depth of my pain. And so I can't keep going in this way that we used to. It feels very inauthentic, but I also don't know how to bridge that gap. People talked about the risks regarding the stigma of ayahuasca drinking. And so part of their need or their perceived need was like, I think I might want to talk to people about this, but I really have a very small pool of people that I feel could hold it in a good way. People talked about restricted economic and geographic access. And so having to take loans, to be able to get this access to this medicine that they felt could be really helpful, but then it caused other problems in their life. The legal risks associated with, especially for those using it underground, like you're trying to heal from a mental health issue And now you're having to deal with, oh my gosh, am I going to get in trouble? If I tell somebody, is the shaman going to get in trouble? And so all this added weight, and then in the study that I did, we interviewed 21 women who had ceremonial experiences with ayahuasca. And one of those 21 women did report an episode of sexual abuse. And so I wondered, are those the stats? Is it 1 in 21? If I would have interviewed 20 more, would it have been 2? And so there was a lot of fear around physical safety, in particular regarding sexual boundaries. So there's a lot to think about, and then if you have a specific mental health issue where you have specific needs in the context of the eating disorder, like I'm, referring to that study, then there's this whole other layer. Okay, am I going to be able to eat my 3 meals? Am I going to be able to keep the weight on? Am I going to be able to, trust that the purging is going to be a healing kind of purge as opposed to a pathological purge? And so there's a lot there for centers, to consider in terms of bringing in folks who do have, diagnoses or serious mental health concerns.
Kim, did you want to?
No, the only thing I was thinking about was when Adele said that they cannot talk to their family. That's something I put in the questions. I think it should be more a holistic thing, or family therapy, that everybody in your surrounding is prepared, and that they also understand that serious things can change after the therapy, that they're all included in the story, and then also potentially a therapist. But I see that is difficult in other countries. Perhaps it's more easy in the Netherlands to talk to a therapist about that.
We've been talking a lot about like the cautions and problems that could arise. I wondered if people have any reflections on like the hype around ayahuasca. Is it really as healing? Is it as amazing as people say, or do you think it's overblown? Give some opinions on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think the healing potential of ayahuasca is extraordinary. And having worked in hospital settings, in clinic settings, in private practice for a decade, when done well, when held well, ayahuasca can support healing that just can't be achieved in the context of conventional treatment methods for some. And when I think about conditions that don't respond to treatment well or easily, I do really want to dedicate more of my life to figuring out how we can do this in a good way, because there are so many people suffering who may benefit from the conventional system to some degree, but still are struggling with major symptoms, quality of life issues. And what I've been able to see in the context of well-run ayahuasca ceremonies is really, really, really powerful and beautiful.
I would echo that. I mean, the overwhelming evidence from my studies is that people find it to be very beneficial and life-changing and healing. I focus on kind of the negative aspects just because I think it's important to point those out and understand what the risks are, especially for different patient populations. But I think the overwhelming evidence is that it is, if done well, to Adele's point, can be very beneficial when a lot of other things fail.
I also think that we have to add a realistic perspective. I always say it's not a world cure. It will not help for everybody, and they should also realize that it's not just doing it and being cured. It's a whole process that starts then. And I think sometimes we bring the message so optimistic or so positive that sometimes we forget to perhaps I am too optimistic and frame it too positive. But we should not forget about that. And I think it should be included in the range of therapies they can get. And then you can just say, you can use this, it can be beneficial for, and perhaps not has negative consequence. They should be able, or they should be offered it. That is the thing. But I would not promise 1% how do you say that? It's not hit rates, but remission rate. And also, that is something I really want to know. How long is duration? Because also with MDMA therapy, we know that people after a couple of sessions, and after a couple of years, they might want to have another session, which is not wrong, but it's also information that you would like to give to patients, that you might be good for now, but additional sessions might be needed, that they are prepared.
That was one of the most upsetting components of a recent study that I did with ketamine, where we did some really beautiful work. They had 3 sessions, deep psychotherapy. At the end, they really did feel benefit, but they were still struggling, and the grief that it was over. And, that's less of a concern with ketamine because it's more readily available, but way more of a concern in the context of research studies with MDMA, psilocybin, and ayahuasca, where they're starting to taste the benefits, and then there's an endpoint in the context of those research studies, and there's no way that they can do it legally. And so that was really, really, really tricky as a clinician / researcher, because I felt so bad. I felt such pain. And I know that Michael and Annie have spoken of the same, with the MDMA study. And so I feel like that's just something really important to build in, not just to the clinical practice, but also to the research study, so that from now on, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to tell people this might really, really help you, and you might not be able to access it in the same way for who knows how long. And I think that that's needs to be part of the informed consent process now.
Yeah, many psychedelics are used by people regularly, like ayahuasca. Churches use them all the time, like monthly or every other week. And, it's not, I think of LSD and like as something that you would take like once and blow your mind, and hopefully not take it every couple of weeks, because I don't think it's a chemical for one thing. But I wondered if you guys talk about like what you see as the difference in treatment with ayahuasca compared to psilocybin or MDMA, how the treatment is offered, and how the effects might be experienced differently.
Again, not a therapist, so I can only speak to kind of some of the research-based things. But and also I've tried several of these myself in my life, and ayahuasca is just far more of an intense experience that I think requires a lot more attention to that intensity and the support that's needed. Whereas psilocybin or MDMA, there is support needed, but it's not quite that deep dive that the ayahuasca experience is. So I think, and then also I think the major difference is whether you're doing it in group or not. I know that a lot of the clinical research done with MDMA and psilocybin is 2 therapists, 1 patient, and then traditional ayahuasca ceremonies are done in groups. So I know that there are efforts to try to do that here in the US, but it's really tricky navigating that through the FDA. But from an economic standpoint, it would be a lot easier to have a couple therapists in a group versus 2 versus 1. But yeah, I think it's just the major difference, like I said, is just the intensity of the experience. Even though they kind of have similar pharmacology, something else is going on with ayahuasca that's just far more intense and transformative.
And Jessica,
I haven't heard very many people. Oh, sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, sorry. There is a delay on the, you're in Belgium, so it takes some time to get signal. So Jessica, I was wondering, you said it's a group thing, and I would love to see more work with MDMA and psilocybin in a group setting, because we know that part of the ayahuasca is also part of the ayahuasca effect is also attributable to the social context. And I think if you have people with mental disorders who are perhaps loners or who feel lonely and then suddenly become part of the group, that is part of the healing. And I would not only see it from an economical standpoint, but just also as part of the healing. So I think that it might add another layer to also MDMA and psilocybin. And it would be interesting to compare all those substances in one study.
Yeah.
I think there is an effort. I know that there is an MDMA study looking at couples therapy where couples get it, and I think that's the closest we have right now. There was the study at UCSF with Brian Anderson where they didn't give psilocybin in group, but then they had all the participants have group integration together. And so I think that was the first study that tried to do that. So hopefully we'll see more of that coming through the pipeline. But I think from kind of a clinical trial standpoint, it's really tricky to get group therapy with psychedelics through the FDA. So hopefully that'll change soon. And once it's actually prescribable, maybe that'll change when it's not kind of under the purview of a clinical trial. It's actually just out in the world in practice.
What time is this session over?
2:10 or something.
50 minutes of discussion.
Okay.
So we start at 12:40 and then open up to questions.
Okay. We have a couple more questions that were generated by our panelists. Let's see, I had written down them, but this.
I can add to the conversation as you situate yourself, Clancy. So one of the other things that I was thinking of with ayahuasca versus the other substances were the predictability. You know, like to me, I see like MDMA is pretty predictable in terms of the arc of the session and the intensity of the session. Psilocybin a little less so, but then ayahuasca to me is like on a whole other level in terms of like really unpredictable. And so I feel like that's an important factor. On the flip side, you know, and I really believe in the process of healing in relationships, that co-regulation leads to the internalization of the capacities to self-regulate. And that's one of the beautiful aspects of the MDMA protocols as they are now, the psilocybin research protocols as they are now, is that for many people, you know, it's a rare event or a never before occurred event to have two people there supporting you for an extended period of time, focused solely on you and your process. Whereas ayahuasca, depending on the circle, the setting, the tradition, you know, you might be on your own aside from a help to the bathroom, and you don't necessarily get that same benefit that I think could still be beneficial in the context of that work, where you're healing in relationship, you're healing through support, you're healing through other people's presence solely focused on you.
No, that's one of the things I liked about ayahuasca was that it was in the dark and people couldn't see you and no one's going to talk to me while I was going through what I was going through. So I guess some people like more attention, but one question that was posed was, who will draw up the guidelines for good practice? Who will select the future therapists? And how can it enter the curricula of psychology or psychiatry? Like, who's going to be in charge? I'm curious to hear what you panelists have to say.
Shared responsibility. Oh, sorry, Kim, you go ahead.
No.
I was like, when Kim was saying that she was putting it into her course outlines, I started doing that when I came home too, and I was like, it felt like this big deal, even though it was like this just little act at that time for me, anyways. But it was really important, you know. And so I think that collectively, if each of us who are in positions where we can influence the curriculum for education for mental health professionals and other disciplines to start slowly bringing that in a good way, that's one piece. But the bigger question, like who's going to be in charge, I feel like I can more readily answer who shouldn't be in charge. Who should be in charge? Diverse individuals. When I talk about diverse, I mean diversity across all domains, with experience, with people with policy, legal, psychology, anthropology, cultural, you know, but I guess I have more concerns about who could end up in charge.
And who are you afraid that will end up in charge?
I worry about the corporate world as they enter the space.
Like psilocybin, wars over the compass and all the commercialization of psilocybin, that really hasn't happened with ayahuasca.
Yeah, I think it's coming. You know, I think corporations are starting to think about opening up retreat centers. And I think that anytime you have to think about a bottom line being financial, when you have to report to your investors, you have to report to, you know, the different groups that are supporting your corporation, I feel like it really increases the likelihood that judgment will be clouded in terms of how care is delivered. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, and so I feel a bit sheepish naming the problem in this way. But I really, really do worry about what the bottom line is in that context.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer. I just put the question there because I'm really curious. We should start thinking about it because there are a lot of enthusiastic people. I'm being asked by clinicians to give lectures because they are really, you feel that there is a need, that they want other tools to deal with. But yeah, who is going to write up the guidelines? I don't know. We should take action.
Right. If you don't, somebody else will, and that's the.
Well, I think there's been a lot of conversations about this. I know, I can't remember what the group was called. They were trying to create some sort of like ethical guidelines around retreat centers and who would be a trusted retreat center. And that kind of, I don't think that went very well in terms of people that maybe didn't know what they were talking about, trying to lend their experience to, you know, a long-held traditional practice. I think it depends on the context. Is this something that's going to be offered in the, you know, in a clinic with the Western medical model paired with psychotherapy? The Western demand for these medicines, I think, runs the risk of decimating the populations. And, you know, it's a sustainability thing of the availability of the medicines. And is it more ethical in that context if it's going to become a major therapy option for people to make a pharmaceutical grade version that doesn't decimate the plants themselves? So they're doing this with psilocybin. I know there's this Ayahuasca that people are trying to develop, you know, where you just take DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and that gives you kind of the same subjective effect, but then you're kind of losing some aspect of the spirit. How that works moving forward, I don't know that there's going to be a formalized structure around that. I mean, we could try to take it to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, or whatever, but then again, that's kind of taking the soul out of it, I think. And so I think there's going to be kind of the more traditional uses of it. And I don't know that anyone on this panel might be able to speak to what those regulations should look like or who the experts should be. But then maybe from the more Western medical model, we might have some ideas around how to standardize it and make it safe for specific conditions paired with specific psychotherapies and things like that.
Indeed, and make it safe. I had some discussions with people already doing these therapies underground, and then they are not angry, but they said, oh, is somebody one day going to tell us that we need certification? We're already doing this and we're doing good work. But I think that you need some level of certification, and if you're already doing it and doing it good, it will be just jumping through the hoop and you're there. It will not be a major hassle, I think, then. And I think they should be included when writing up the guidelines. You should be able to, if you have a certificate, you know that it's safe for you to go there, right? I also had conversations with a patient who phoned me up who said, look, I went to an underground therapist. I had an MDMA session. It went totally wrong. My trauma is very bad now. Should I enter your study now? And I'm like, yeah. So no, but how did your session went? And she said, okay, yeah, it was just the one-off MDMA, not a lot of integration. And said, okay, yeah, it can be done in a different way. So I really think that we should discuss what the minimal is for a good therapy.
Yeah, I just want to say, short of making chemical ayahuasca, the ayahuasca churches have plantations of ayahuasca, and that's how they manage that, and it does grow pretty well, and you could make a farm of it. They do for Santo Daime and UTV. So I don't know if it's necessary to jump to chemicals right now. I mean, I know you're not saying right now, but I think there's
I just think of like the Western demand. I just think we tend to over harvest everything because there's just this, I mean, the desperation. I mean, I also get contacted by people wanting to be involved in research, and the desperation is very intense. People just, they're suffering, they want to heal. And so, and then we're seeing this in the space with psilocybin, all these venture capitalists jumping on board and trying to make a profit off of it. You know, so I think it's just, we got to be careful moving forward. Because I know, like in the 60s, when people were doing mescaline and the peyote crops were getting decimated because everyone wanted to try it, you know, so just keeping that in mind.
I just also want to say that psilocybin is also easy to grow and can be grown by the people who want to take it.
Yeah, but to help science, so I had a couple of thoughts racing through my mind. So we have been talking about companies. I know that there is a tension field, but in one way we need them because these studies are so expensive and we want to progress with science. But they should not monopolize the substances. And the other thing is that yes, you can grow psilocybin yourself, but the tricky thing is that we cannot use it in studies, and it has to be GMP, and it's so difficult to find these substances. Otherwise, we would have done tons of studies, and then they are so expensive. That's also a hurdle. So I think there is a benefit in using the natural substances because they come with other components. It's not only the psychoactive substance that we study in the lab, but it's the whole package. But still, I think both studies should be done that we're able to compare what the best mixture is.
Okay, we're almost at 11:40, so I think it's time to take some questions from the question and answer section of this. I know some of the questions have already been answered, but and some look like statements. Let me just make sure I'm in the Q&A. Questions? Okay, so here's someone curious to know if any of the panelists have thoughts on the peace-building potential of ayahuasca, specifically within the context of violent conflict prevention or resolution.
I can speak to that a little bit. I did a presentation recently on the power of ayahuasca psychedelics on healing conflict. And the first level we look at inner conflict. There's a theory that inner conflict reflects outer conflict reflects inner conflict. And so when we each do our own work and we look at our own inner conflicts, that'll change the way we show up in the world. And I've done some work with families in the context of psychedelic medicines, and even in the research that I've conducted, you know, many people talked about how drinking ayahuasca in particular helped them to move beyond forgiveness, to realize that there was actually nothing to forgive, that everyone was doing the best that they could, and you know, they're bumping around each other as humans, and there was a lot of peacemaking that occurred kind of spontaneously, engendered by these medicinal experiences. And then Lior at Imperial and Natalie Ginsberg from MAPS and others have done this really beautiful study, and they're doing more research looking at Israelis and Palestinians who drank together, not for the purpose of healing conflict, but who were sitting together in circle for their own personal healing, and how they had these wonderful experiences that were very unity-based, like seeing the other outside of the constraints within the society, within the culture, within the religion. And one of the kind of coolest things I heard from them when I was consulting with them early days about this nature, the systemic nature of this kind of healing, was that in these particular ceremonies, individuals were invited to either share songs from their culture or religion, or share prayers from their culture or religion. And they had people on the other side of the culture, you know, so the Israelis were having these really powerful experiences listening to these Palestinian songs and vice versa. And I hope I'm getting it right. I don't want to misrepresent the data, but it is published, and so it can be reviewed now. But I was just so encouraged by these findings, because I feel like slowly but surely, you know, this is going to be part of our evolution in terms of how we get along out there in the world. And I think that plant medicines and other psychedelics can have a really significant role to play in the individual's conflict, in the family conflict, as well as in broader conflict. But I mean, it's not going to happen overnight and without other things happening. Like, it's not just going to be ayahuasca drinking. We need to have policy change and legal challenges and talk about borders, you know, and all these really tricky conversations.
Either of you want to chime in? No? So on that note, sort of, someone has asked, can the panelists speak to the way in which Icaros might be used and studied in clinical and research settings? I know those are very powerful in sessions, and is there a way to quantify or understand how they work?
A whole field around studying the integration of music with psychedelic therapy, you know, and I know in my survey study, that was one of the major themes that popped up that people found to be profoundly helpful, was the songs, was the Icaros. And, you know, I haven't experienced that myself, but I just want to, I've heard Joseph Tafur talk about this. I think he has an anecdote in his book, Fellowship of the River, about singing Icaros and being able to see how it was changing somebody's energy and like being able to adapt that. And so, you know, I guess you could do some kind of study to see if there's a specific subject matter that comes up in the songs, or if it's like a standardized song. I think with like the modern psychedelic therapy, you know, they like to have the same playlist each time, but it seems like from these more shamanic practices, they're really tailoring the song to kind of what the person's presenting. And so it would be interesting to see what is the variability in that and what works and what doesn't. And I think, was it Adele, did you talk about kind of trying to study what maybe the shamanic perspective is, or the therapist perspective is, and kind of what was their thought process around how they decided that specific song? I think that could be really interesting, but no doubt that the musical aspect of it plays a huge role in the healing process.
And if we had all of the kind of allowances and the flexibility, like one of the interesting ways we could look at this was, I think about the study that came out in 2019, the rapid antidepressant effects of psychedelic ayahuasca. And it was a randomized placebo control trial in the lab. And I was thinking, well, if we did that, and then one group had no music, another group had, you know, a recording of music, and another group had, you know, an individual who trained in this practice, and then we compared those three groups, that could give us a lot of information. I mean, they wouldn't be perfect. There'd be all these other elements brought in, the human elements in particular, but I think you could begin to answer that question.
Or you could get a shaman to sing real Icaros and then nonsense Icaros, and see if people have any different reaction to them. Okay. See.
Made me think of, there's this technique that was developed in the 60s called the Bonnie method, which is like really trying to sit with somebody and almost like improvise the music to meet what they need in their psychedelic experience. So it just kind of seems like an adaptation of that.
It's called the Bonnie method?
The Bonnie method.
Oh.
I think it was a woman, her last name was Bonnie. I think she also worked with Bill Richards in the early days. And if you just Google it, there's a whole field around this of like music therapy.
Here someone has written, are there elements of set and setting appropriate for ayahuasca and not other psychedelic substances, and vice versa? It's a good question.
Well, the one that comes to mind for me is women's menstrual cycle. It doesn't seem to have come up in any of my trainings or research studies with other compounds. But with respect to ayahuasca, it's a very important element of the preparation of the set and of the setting, whether the woman is wearing a tobacco belt, or she's asked not to sit until the first 2 days of her period have passed, or that's kind of one of the elements that kind of strikes me as quite different between ayahuasca and the other compounds.
So in research, would you follow that? Like how would that be integrated into research?
I would love to figure that out, because there are so many feelings around the exclusion of women on their cycle from ayahuasca ceremonies. And I've asked, different ceremonial leaders, like, what's your perspective? Why is this happening? What's your perspective? Why is this happening? And there's a lot of variability in terms of their reporting, which, makes me wonder more about that. And I would love to kind of do a more in-depth study of the role of menstrual cycle, moon time, in the context of the ceremony, both for the participant and for the ceremonial leader. 'Cause someone told me, well, like, oh, you're only supposed to, as a ceremonial leader, you're only supposed to sing to a woman who's on their cycle if you have this particular diet. And this particular diet is a very extensive diet, and you shouldn't do it otherwise. Whereas others, don't share that same opinion. So I would start off with some qualitative research to begin, in order to clear the path for like what to do next.
But you raise an interesting point, because the cycle can influence. If you take amphetamines, you will have a different outcome depending on your cycle. So that might be interesting to look into, whether you have more beneficial effects, and you're also losing minerals it's interesting. I have to think about it some more. So it could influence the therapeutic effect in the end.
Yeah, I don't know if you know about this cycle sync. Have you heard of that? It's this whole like diet and way that you take care of yourself during your menstrual period that's different for each, the 4 cycles that they've broken it up into. Anyway, it's quite an aside. Here's someone who's written about Kim's statement on standardizing research questions for practitioners and communities. Do you have suggestions for questions or resources to reference as our community starts collecting data?
Very good question, and a very difficult question. I think Adele also raised it. I think at this moment, we do not have very good questionnaires or very good objective measures to really quantify what is happening. And I also loved what Adele said, we should focus on love. And I was thinking about this during the whole day today. How can we quantify love? How could we do that? So yes, we can do suggestions about, I would say use questionnaires that are used by researchers now, because we have objective data from the lab, and then they could or we could compare it with the retreat settings. But I think we need to improve on that aspect. I do not know what Adele and Jessica think.
Yeah, I can add that I think that the first step is that if there's a collective mass who can agree on a subset of measures, and then we go with that, learn from that experience, and then expand, or individual retreat centers could include other measures that are, perhaps unique to their processes. That's one piece. The other piece is I'm really interested in mechanisms of action. And so when I scour the literature looking at mechanisms of action, then I want to find well-validated instruments that correspond with the either theorized mechanisms of action or the ones that have been shown in research. And I did a study recently where we found that spirituality and emotion regulation seem to mediate the experiences of between psychedelic use and improved outcomes on mental health issues. And so when I collect data, and we're working on a paper right now from an ayahuasca retreat, I made sure to include, instruments related to emotion regulation. So we used the DERS, the difficulties in emotion regulation scale. We also used well-known, validated, researched, used instruments to look at symptomatology. So the Beck inventories, for example, for anxiety and depression are well used. They're a bit more expensive, so there are others that are less costly, but the eating attitudes tests is another one. But I think that fundamentally, and I was part of a group who did this in a province, so not what we're talking about on the global scale, but we agreed on 8 measures, or 10 measures. and we administered each of those measures to all of our participants, and then we pooled the data across 40 different sites. And that was enough for us to both lobby for more funding and be able to speak to trends that were true or true-ish across a very homogeneous.
And I think we don't have to overburden people because in our experience, we want to get the most out of research. So we put a lot of questions in there. And then most of the time we have baseline data, but then people are not interested anymore or they forget about it. So it should be a trade-off. What do we really want to know? And I also, something else is ethics approval. That is, at least at my university, there are a lot of people coming to me and say, look, we have these data, I've done therapy, do you want to do something with it? And then I have to say, I can ask retroactively for approval, but our ethics committee is not that fond of it. Perhaps at other universities it works differently. So you should start with an ethics approval, I think. And then another thing I also want to raise is I do not know whether you're familiar with Quantified Citizen. They have this platform. They have an app which can be used by people to collect data. They are starting up, and something like this can be interesting. It is their aim to make data available for everybody. So and we can benefit all from it. But so look into the literature for questionnaires we all use and ask for ethics approval. Approach a researcher and ask them whether they could file for ethics approval.
Okay, I'm sort of following on that. Do you think it is NIH-supported clinical research with psychedelics? There is only a 2021 funded NIMH project, K23, on the neural effects of psilocybin in the treatment of OCD. So I guess the question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's a little tricky. I think there's a congressional ban on trying to research Schedule I drugs that would reschedule them. I've heard this anecdotally. I know there's been some issues on this around cannabis. I have NIH grants, and I talked to my program officer about this, and she's like, a grant might do well, but then administratively they might have to reject it because of this congressional ban. I think when Andrea Ocasio-Cortez first took office, when she was first elected to the Congress, she tried to have this overturned and it failed miserably. But there are ways to do this. Like I think the Hopkins group, they apply for NIDA funding. So this is the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So people are getting NIH funding to study it as a drug of abuse. And then, lo and behold, there's actually beneficial things happening. So it's like still getting the money. But I think it would be a huge statement for NIMH to come out, the National Institute of Mental Health, to come out and support funding around this. I mean, we're seeing articles coming out in JAMA Psychiatry about psilocybin for depression. Rick Doblin announced yesterday that the MDMA study is coming out in Nature Medicine. That's one of the best journals you can publish. So I think all of that hopefully is going to change the mindset of what NIH, specifically NIMH, will fund. But right now I think they kind of shoot things down just for overarching congressional purposes that we just need to chip away at with good science. But that is the rate limiting factor here, is the funding. It's expensive to do this kind of work. You have to pay people, you have to pay the participants, you have to pay for all the data collection. And, right now, most of that's funded by rich people that are willing to give their money to research centers. And that's not really a sustainable option.
Yeah. There's some questions in here about this all-white panel and the involvement of Indigenous people in this research, or like how can Indigenous people's viewpoints be integrated into the research? Anybody have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I can say you have to acknowledge that yes. Even when we conducted our qualitative research study on ceremonial leaders, because of translation issues and budgetary constraints, we did not get the kind of diversity that we need. And to these questions. And so we really have to consider a follow-up where we do things differently and in a way to the indigenous people's views of the world, views of science, and their reservations about it that are that are not unfounded, you know.
And is there a way to get them involved in the research, or I don't know?
But I think anthropologists will be the best way to go, right? Collect data via different expertise.
Actually serving on a dissertation committee for a Native American woman at the university that I work at, who wants to look at using traditional plant medicine to bring healing into her tribe and her community. So I think there's efforts to do that, but I think the academic pursuit of psychedelic research is a very kind of westernized white space, as academia is in general. And I think that's what's reflected in this panel, is kind of the scientific investigation of psychedelics tends to be predominantly white. I think the goal of this was to not have a mantle, as some people have been talking about, but it's still, you know, we are all white women studying plant medicines. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and look to ways that we can incorporate and honor the traditions of what we're studying.
Okay. Here's someone who's written, regarding the importance of ritual, regardless if it's traditional or not. How do we ensure we aren't trivializing the traditional rituals through creating new ones in relation to sacred plants?
I can speak to that since, you know, I brought it up earlier. One of my colleagues, we went abroad and drank ayahuasca, and one of the major revelations that he had was that he wanted to do his clinical practice in a way that was more sacred. And so it was less a focus on the ritual per se and more a focus on the sacred. And reflecting how to make clinical practice more sacred, it was a natural kind of movement towards looking at rituals that are meaningful and that we felt, you know, were sacred, and or that could be experienced as sacred by the other. But it is a very important point that we don't want to just do rituals to do rituals. In fact, there's a negative connotation to the term ritual in many circles. And so I even question the use of that term myself when I talk about it in clinic and in research. But yeah, it's a very important point. So I thank the person who brought that up.
Okay. I have a question for Adele. How do you work with ayahuasca with people who are bulimic? He says, I've noticed concerns in some with the purge aspect, possibly exacerbating the bulimia. You talked a little bit about that, but
yeah,
it's a recent question.
I don't have the full picture, not even close, but when we did our studies, we asked specifically about the purge. We asked about two elements, specifically to the behavioral aspects, symptomatology of an eating disorder. One was the pre-diet restrictions, and the second was the in-ceremony purge. And the pre-diet restrictions were reported by many to be triggering, including people who felt like they were further along in their recovery process and like, oh, you know, these food restrictions are awakening some unhealed parts of myself. The purge, however, was actually, there was not a single person that we interviewed that as a symptom purge, but rather as that being a long history of purging, and I've consulted with different centers around this. There can be lesions that occur in the esophagus that can increase medical risk in individuals with a history of bulimia nervosa through vomiting. And so from a medical point of view, look at the potential for these lesions, but also for other abnormalities when it comes to electrolytes, cardiac function, the risk of stroke. And so even when we were constructing MDMA, we wanted to study binge eating, bulimia, and anorexia. I wanted to have small groups in each so that we could start to learn. And after consulting with the eating disorder specialist from the medical field, we actually decided to remove the bulimia condition nervosa, the bulimia nervosa condition, because we were just a bit too anxious about the potential side effects related to the medicine use. Just not very well known. So if anyone has bulimia and they're thinking about going to an ayahuasca retreat, my strong recommendation would be to do a lot of prep work ahead of time in order to reduce the frequency of symptomatology, and also have someone come with you as a support person, and then consider whether, if you're able to stay the whole time. Now, if it's not severe and you're asking more about the purge in the context of the ayahuasca, I found, just based on that very limited research study, that didn't seem to be a problem. It doesn't mean that it's not for everyone, and that's why we need those bigger qualitative studies in order to get that richness of data.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to ask again, what time does this panel end?
10 minutes.
In 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
All right.
So here's a question. Can you comment on steward ownership, ethical governance, and practitioner-led clinics and centers as an alternative to the corporate businesses that are dominating the space? So I guess they're talking about exactly that. No?
Repeat the question.
I can. Can you comment on steward ownership, ethical governance, and practitioner-led clinics and centers as an alternative to the corporate businesses that are dominating the space? So I guess it's like grassroots versus things. And
Well, I feel
that
like with ayahuasca, I mean, a lot of it is sort of these retreat centers. I don't know that we're seeing yet a whole bunch of these clinics popping up like we're seeing with kind of the psilocybin therapist trainings and kind of all these things. So I don't know that it's there yet. It could lead to that. But hopefully it stays honest and it stays kind of within those that are looking to heal people rather than make money off of other people's suffering.
Yeah. I guess it's the intensity of ayahuasca. You had said earlier that makes it stand out from the other medicines, but it also seems a lot about set and setting, in my opinion, how it's administered. Like, it really makes such a big difference.
That I've noticed with ayahuasca centers popping up is that if I've been contacted by a few folks from that world, and it seemed to be like, oh, we want to target what's the term, highly influential people, so that we can help heal them and they can heal others. I think what they meant was people who have a lot of money. So if the ayahuasca retreat centers are hosting individuals who are high impact people, then they can charge more and meet their bottom lines. And I mean, yeah, high impact people deserve healing as much as anyone else. But I don't know. It's gonna be really tricky to. I think that those centers are really gonna have to build strong indigenous people of those lands who are making the medicines, find ways to integrate them in a good way. I hope it goes well, and I hope that these kinds of conversations help help guide the development of these processes. It's just not something that I feel comfortable being a part of right now in terms of that corporate world. As a consultant to help, sure, but yeah, it's a tricky space, and one that I have a lot of discomfort around. And it could be my own triggers. It could be my own personal work that has yet to be done. I'm not quite sure yet, but I don't know. I'd rather for now stick to the research and the practice.
Somebody here asks, do panelists have opinions on whether ayahuasca should be decriminalized or legalization with other psychedelics? What about legalization? Okay, let's hear the opinions on that.
I mean, I'm all for I think, drug policy advocates would say decriminalization might be better because then there's not all this potential commercialization around it. And how do you regulate that? And just letting people do it. And it's not even a legal issue. It's just, people can do it. And if it becomes problematic, then that's more of a mental health issue. So yes, I think people should be able to have access to what they want. And hopefully there's enough resources and social systems in place that if it becomes problematic use, there's a container for that doesn't put people into the system and traumatize them.
Yes, but you say people should have access to these substances whenever they want. But I think it should be sold only with guidance. You cannot let people. I think there are a lot of people who are really hopeful, and then think that it will heal them and do it on their own, and then it might worsen their condition. We talked about it earlier, and also about legalizing. I'm not into these regulations, but I also think that people should be aware that if you make something legal, it's not safe per se. I was approached a couple of months ago by somebody who stated, look, I want to go to court or legalize microdosing with psilocybin or something. Can you help me? Just stating that it's safe. I said, I cannot do that. We are representing science, and sure, millions of people have taken these substances, millions, even more, for I do not know how many times. So yes, it is safe, but science cannot state it at this moment. So it is really tricky, I think. And also to open it up for everybody, I really want to, and that's perhaps that's my opinion. I want to preserve it for people who are really suffering, who cannot get to the next level in their life without help. I think that sometimes you also need to put some efforts to get a better version of yourself, and some people will be able to do that, and some people will not be able to do that, and then we have these tools to help people. But I think that people will others will differ from opinion.
From my perspective, why I am not why I would prefer legalization over decriminalization is that as a practicing psychologist, I can't support someone with a substance that's decriminalized. My professional practice guidelines make it so that I can only support someone with a substance that's legalized. I mean, there's not even a framework for that yet, but the people will say to me, oh, it's decriminalized. Oh, aren't you excited? You'll be able to open up a clinic. I'm like, no, I can't. It doesn't mean that it's legal. And I have to follow not just the laws, but professional practice standards. And so that means that decriminalized means that trained therapists, psychotherapists are not able to do this in a way that is consistent with their guidelines. And so legalization opens up that door for people to get the kind of help they're needing, including help from professionals.
Yeah, I hear both of your reservations. I'm thinking more like not everyone that wants to do these substances is doing it to treat some mental health disorder. And so why should that be the only route of access? Some people do it just as a spiritual practice, so what would that look like? Does it have to be legal? And then, we have other substances that are ridiculously harmful that are legal, like alcohol and tobacco. So I just feel like they should be held to the same standard.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, right? I wondered if anybody had anything to say that they didn't have a chance to say so far, who's on the panel, and if not,
I just want to say thank you to you, Clancy, and to Bia for your efforts for putting together this panel, and then of course the broader conference. And we've talked a lot about ayahuasca and different ways of doing it. And I just want to let people know that there's a fundraiser right now looking at the religious freedoms of ayahuasca use that's being hosted by Shakruna. And so if anyone's watching, listening, interested in supporting the legal processes that are moving forward to try to make a big change in how ayahuasca is available and served in North America, I think it's a really worthy cause.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. Appreciate it. And one more push, which
Upside down.
I want healing in science, which these are all authors that have chapters in this book. So
Yes,
Yeah,
congratulations.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
yes, congratulations to all of you, and I appreciate your participation in our conference.